Let me tell you a little bit who I am and why I've got an interest in myalgic encephalomyelitis, ME/CFS, and long COVID. So I'm an Emeritus Professor of Biochemistry, and that means an academic researcher, and I've had over 50 years involvement in research. For the last 30 years I've been involved in studying unexplained human diseases, and for the last 10, myalgic encephalomyelitis, and then more recently long COVID. And my interest in these diseases is because I come from an ME family. I have two members of my immediate family that have had ME for up to 30 years now. And so I come from this looking with a dual lens. Firstly, as a member of an ME family that has really sort of been a spectator to how debilitating ME/CFS is for those affected minute by minute for over 30 years, and also as a scientist, and I've tried to bring those two things together to find out some things about what's going on in these diseases, and now it'll be with long COVID. My own research has tried in the last 10 years really to understand what's going on in the disturbed physiology in ME/CFS patients and to understand the molecular changes which are causing the symptoms. So all my studies have been with ME/CFS patients, and I've tried to define really the biological causes of the disease and to see if I can determine some molecular signatures that characterize the disease. And in late 2020, I managed to actually find two signatures, one in immune cell proteins, which signaled a defect in energy production and also dysfunction in immune inflammatory response, and a second molecular signature in DNA in what's called the epigenetic code. This is where there are modifications to some of the bases in our DNA, and they act as light switches, on-off switches or dimmer switches to control the expression of all the information we've got in our DNA. And what I've discovered was that ME/CFS patients that we studied have unique signatures which is different from healthy controls. And excitingly, from at least the point of the science, is that their epigenetic code is so much more unstable than healthy controls. And so this can explain why their control of all of their physiology throughout their illness is not as great as what would be with a healthy person. More recently, we've been doing two studies, comparative studies on long COVID and ME/CFS. The first really was addressing a question which hasn't been addressed properly internationally, and that is, why does quite a large minority of people, why are they susceptible to come down with these post-stressor syndromes after an initial infection or initial stress event? For example, in long COVID, it's thought about 1 in 5 people get long COVID after a SARS-CoV-2 infection. And for ME/CFS, people who have glandular fever, about 1 in 10 or 1 in 20 of those come down with ME/CFS. So why are they susceptible? And so we've done a quantitative survey with a master's student, Anna Blair, and she recruited 160 ME/CFS patients and 57 long COVID patients, and asked some questions. For example, can we determine anything from their prior health history which might say why they're susceptible? And what she found was a couple of things, is that on average, each of the recruited people had 2 underlying health conditions at the time of the survey, but also reported problems in earlier life with recovering from viral illnesses and really the frequency. So there does seem to be a connection between prior health history and whether you come down with these syndromes. The second question that Anna asked was, could we determine any familial connection? And that was, she asked whether any of the person's siblings or parents or grandparents or cousins or aunts and uncles had similar kinds of fatigue syndromes. And she found there was a statistically significant connection between that we call this proper genetic susceptibility. That is to say, unfortunately, the people that come down with the syndromes have probably drawn the short straw in terms of their genetic inheritance. So that's the reason. The other thing, from the connection between long COVID and ME/CFS, we asked a lot of questions about the symptoms, and remarkably in both disease groups they all reported very similar responses to the symptom questions, with one or two exceptions. The loss of taste and smell in the long COVIDs is not seen in ME/CFS. Long COVID seemed to have a few more skin problems, and also, as I've discovered because a professor of music at Otago University contacted me about this, they have problems with losing voice, and for singers, losing the ability to sing properly. So that's three unique things which probably relate to the SARS-CoV-2 virus, which is not seen necessarily with ME/CFS, whereas ME/CFS patients reported more food intolerances, so there might be specific things according to their cause of their illness. Interestingly, just recently, because there's been really no good studies on genetic susceptibility, there was a paper, preprint paper, so it hasn't been peer-reviewed yet, from an Oxford company who accessed the UK biobank for samples and looked to see whether there was an association between variation in DNA and coming down with the illness. So they did what's called a genome-wide association screen, and that is looking at all of the variations in DNA that are found from person to person. So although we have 3 billion bases in our DNA genomes, the reason that we're different from our partners and our friends and our neighbours is that there are about 2 million variations in the human genome. Now that's only about 0.1%, but 2 million is still a lot. So they looked at these 2 million genetic variations, what we call single nucleotide polymorphisms, to see if they could determine if any of them were associated with developing ME/CFS. And it turned out 199 were, and they were connected to 14 genes, but what they and that accounted for 91% of the cases for the samples they examined of ME/CFS. But it wasn't that each patient had to have the 199 variations. There were 15 clusters, so you just had to have a grouping of some of these 199, and that gave you a susceptibility to the disease. So we know this is the best evidence yet. There's genetic susceptibility, and unfortunately it's the DNA you inherit that actually can give you the susceptibility. So the other main study we've been involved in is we recruited a small number of long COVID patients when long COVID first came into New Zealand, and age gender matched ME/CFS people and age gender matched healthy controls. And what we wanted to look for is whether the molecular signatures that we had derived for ME/CFS just a year before were present in the long COVID people. So we've done two major studies. One is on the immune cell proteins, where we got one of the signatures, and the other on the epigenetic code with the other. The data for the epigenetic code is still being analysed as I speak, so I can't really speak to the conclusions from that. But for the immune cell protein study, what we collected information on 4,000 immune cell proteins in each patient, so we got huge amounts of data. And what we can do is stratify that by doing what's called a principal component analysis and just look to see whether the individuals separate out at all into groups. And an amazing separation we had was from the 2 disease groups and the healthy controls. They completely separated, and that says, well, these 2 disease groups have certainly got dysfunctions. And then we looked at, well, what about between long COVID and ME/CFS? And we found that, in fact, they clustered together. I mean, they just overlap. We couldn't actually separate them. And so what that's telling us is that from the immune cell signature we derive for ME/CFS, long COVID has a very similar signature. And in fact, the reality is they're looking like very similar diseases as we would have hoped. And the reason we hope that they are very similar, because all of the intense attention and investment in research that's going on now is virtually occurring solely with long COVID, but the ME/CFS community will benefit from it if the diseases are very similar. So the epigenetic code is certainly affected by all the things that happen in our life. It's really the nurture side of the nature-nurture equation. And so we know with other diseases, people's epigenetic code can change. So in some ways, you could say it wasn't such a surprise with ME/CFS that they would show differences. But what they will have is their prior history, what other stresses and things that are going on in their life, what other conditions that might influence the individual genetic epigenetic code. And interestingly enough, we have done a study, which we've just published in October, on a longitudinal study now with individual patients, and this is where my research is going at the moment, is actually trying to get into longitudinal studies following a patient for a period of time. This was taking blood samples over a year and seeing whether there's this individual difference among patients, but also how it changes. Now, interesting enough, with those 2 patients over the year, we've done multiple what's called DNA methylomes, looking at their epigenetic code, each sample, and we found that in both of the 2 ME/CFS subjects, there was dramatic variation from month to month, and that's when I said before the epigenetic code is much more unstable than the healthy control. About 1 to 2% variation from month to month of these sites on the DNA, which is controlling the expression of our genes, whereas in the case of the healthy controls, 1 in 1,000 per month. So a huge difference between the 2. What we did see is individual variations between the 2 patients, and that can reflect, their life experiences. It might also just reflect their genetics as well. And what we were trying to do with this study was to capture a relapse of the patient during the year period. So when I recruited these 2 young women, university students, I said, you have to guarantee to have a relapse during the year. And so I thought no one would volunteer, but these 2 were happy to do the study. And we caught them both in a relapse, one that lasted 2 months and one that lasted a month. And so we were able then to do methylomes before, through the relapse and after, and look to see if we could see individual changes. And remarkably, we could see single sites on the 3 billion bases changing and then being restored once they came out of the relapse. But they were different from the 2 ME patients. However, the end result of the dysfunctional physiology that came out of that relapse was the same. In other words, they showed they had less energy production, and so it affected energy production, but in different ways. They had an immune inflammatory response, as we might have predicted from going into a relapse, but from different causes. So individual patients can respond in different ways in their pathways, but with the same end result. And this is the reason why I think that we should look at these diseases from the individual point of view, not necessarily just from the disease point of view, and also why I think future studies need to be looking at individual patients, not just sort of 1,000 patients and then averaging out all of the things that are going on, in their dysfunctional physiology. Yes, so this is, from my own family and my own 14-year-old daughter, and what I did when she came down with the illness when we didn't know really what was going on, there would be quite a few changes. I've got a family in my study at the moment. I've got two young children with ME/CFS, and I'm in constant contact with the mother, and we're exchanging information. So one of the first things that happen, of course, the instinct of the individual, even young children, they want to retain their lifestyle even though they might be severely debilitated. My daughter, when she came down with ME/CFS, could only really walk about 5 or 10 metres at a time, and yet she still wanted to go to school because she loved school and she had a network of friends. And so I did the worst thing possible. For the first 3 weeks when the illness was like this, I took her to school and sort of dropped her in a classroom. And the chemistry teacher, who once worked for me, brought her home at about 10:30 in the morning every day. And we came to an agreement after about 3 weeks that this couldn't go on. So, it's very hard for a family when you see the joy of a young person just kind of being sucked out. And of course, young people don't understand chronic illness. The network of friends don't. And so one of the worst things was just the gradual losing of the friends network. That was devastating. So, just paying attention to those things is quite important. The other thing is, there were some dramatic things that happened to my daughter's health. One was that she became intolerant to all of food virtually, and so my wife had to design, food item by food item, flour, different types of flour, to see what she could have so she could get nutrition, because 90% of the things that she had been eating, she had a severe allergy to. The other thing was the hypersensitivity of the senses. Now, I'd never, of course, experienced this before, but ME people and Long COVID people have this hypersensitivity of all of the sensory things, and this can be noise, it can be light. So, we learnt with time that we had to darken the room that my daughter was in. I couldn't bang a nail in for 3 years on a weekend. You can think how hard that is for a typical Kiwi male, that just has a hammer in his, hand as soon as he gets home, kind of thing. So that was like torture to my daughter. So we had to learn all of those kinds of things. And the young family I'm dealing with now with 2 children, each child is kind of a bit different, but watching TV is something which can be very overstimulating, and so parents can help control that. Trying, as I say, if you can, without too much sort of anxiety, to get some friends to come and visit them was good. The other thing we found as a family, because the disease was not well understood, the medical profession didn't really wasn't at all helpful. A senior clinician told me that, my daughter just didn't want to go to school. That was what was the problem with it. Well, we knew that was kind of ridiculous. So we felt as a family very alone, very unsupported. I think it's great today that there are networks of families, there are social media groups which have families. And so I would sort of say that, if you have children that come down with this, try and find people that have experienced the same thing, because they will have found out things in looking after their children that will be helpful to you. It may not be the same things for every child, but you'll be incredibly supported. For me personally, I've been associated with a church group. I was a youth leader for 10 years, and the church knew that my daughter was ill, didn't know what was going on, but they just came and said they'd like to hold a prayer day for my daughter. They didn't ask any questions. They didn't say, is this a real disease? Is it psychological or psychiatric, which the medical profession at the time were kind of implying. They just did it. I found that very affirming for me personally, perhaps more so than my wife, who was traumatized. The other thing we did as a family is that my daughter had a lot of pain in the night, and she needed my wife to be with her during the night, and something that she didn't want me to be there, so I couldn't really share that. But I found that after about 6 weeks of doing that, my wife would just get at such a low ebb that she had to go off, and so she would go into Queenstown and stay in a caravan for about 3 days, and I was amazed that she could come back and she was refreshed, and so just having things in place to try and protect the family while all these stresses are going on is so important. I think the good thing is today with long COVID, because of the pandemic with 640 million cases worldwide and so many cases of long COVID, of course all of health professionals around the world have heard of this, and many people in society and governments and whatever. So at least people will understand if someone has this illness as a child, and I think will be more supportive. So friends, family and health professionals will probably be giving a lot more support than we were able to get at the time, over 30 years ago. So this is quite difficult, but I think if you recognise that you have, children get COVID and so have, potential to get long COVID, and they have certain characteristics, like, as I was saying, maybe long time for recovering from viral illness and things like that. Really what has to happen is supportive of them resting and maybe getting them to, helping them to take up things that might benefit them. My daughter, for example, at 14, we had a Reiki teacher come up to our house, and this person was happy to come up and teach my daughter how to do Reiki on herself. So when the worst symptoms were coming on, she was able to do Reiki and help her. So, anticipating some of these things, I think we are at a stage now where we might be able to anticipate who the more vulnerable members of the family are, and just ensure that there are practices going on which, really allow, if any near coming down with long COVID or with ME/CFS, of course, there's a period before a diagnosis is made, 3 months for long COVID, 6 months for ME/CFS. This is a period where I think healing can occur. And so if one can quieten down the inflammation, peripheral inflammation, quieten down the inflammation that's going on in the brain and the central nervous system by, things like Reiki or some meditation or things that you could get children to do that would be calming, I think these could be very helpful. The thing not to do, however, I would say is that, again, something which we did, and I knew as a scientist this was wrong, because of the desperation, everyone wants to try everything. So you try every supplement, maybe you get some prescriptions from your health professional, maybe you do some behavioural things, and all of these are piled up on each other. They're often very expensive, so this can, stress the family finances. But also, if you have 10 things, you're doing 10 things, they can be counterproductive for each other. So it's not a good way to find something which might be helpful either in a preventative way or in a way with someone who has the illness. So really one should be trying one thing and seeing whether this is good for a child as a preventative measure or good for the child to alleviate some of the symptoms. And if it's not, then put that aside and try something else, trying to do it one at a time, not just piling everything on top of each other. So what are some of the key things that a parent can do to help their children if they come down with either ME, CFS or long COVID? I mean, one of the things is believe in them and what they're going through and what they're feeling. And I say that because young women of my daughter's age who came down with the disease, and as young teenagers, after I've given talks, have come up to me in tears and said, "Your daughter's so lucky to have a father like you," which of course was very embarrassing. But because they've said, "My father just doesn't believe in my disease. He just wants me to get up out of bed and go to school and do this." So, just have belief and support and try and create an environment for the children and the family member which is supportive and empathetic and wraps around them to give them the best chance of healing would be one thing. I think having sensitivity to the specific things that might be going on, particularly with children, as I say, like the sensitivity to light and sound and smells. My daughter could have smells that we couldn't smell. It's almost like they become dog-like in the sense of their sensitivity to things. And a clinician in upstate New York who visited Eden told me that he had a group of young teenagers come to his practice with a fatigue-type illness, and he didn't know really anything about it. And he said they all wore dark glasses and hats, and he said he thought this was some new fashion or fad, and then he discovered later it was kind of their own response to, the light sensitivity. And so that's important. Obviously finding a clinician who at least affirms the illness. I talk to now third-year medical students one session, been doing that since 2013, and students often ask me in fear, really, what do I do if I have an ME CFS patient, now will be a long COVID patient, come into my office? And I say, well, just affirm that they're ill, believe in the illness, don't have body language or whatever which says really, I'm putting you into the psychiatric box already because I don't understand what's going on, Parents can do things like when my daughter had a medical appointment. Now what often happens is you go to the doctors and you sit in the waiting room for an hour and a half sometimes, maybe if you're lucky less. And the energy level of the person with ME CFS or long COVID will just spiral down. And so I got to I would ring up the receptionist and say, will you call me when we're 5 minutes away from an appointment, so I could take my daughter down and so she could go and meet. And they were pretty cross about that initially, but we got that done. Another specialist clinician who my daughter had to see, again, she had to wait an hour and a half in a hospital clinic. She was in total meltdown by the time her appointment came, and he concluded that, she was an unstable young woman, So parents can just kind of intervene and know how to intervene. When my daughter had bouts of pancreatitis, during her acute phase of ME CFS, not common at all, and the hospital routine, and I think this would be for any person with ME going in, is that you're woken up early in the morning and the shades go up and whatever, and that was like a torture to my daughter. So one night when I was in, there was a compliant nurse there, and I found there was a storage room that actually fitted a bed, and so we pushed her bed into the storage room in the dark, and she was discovered about midday the next day, so she actually got a reasonable night's sleep. So that's kind of bizarre, but it does point out that the system is not geared up for people with these kinds of illnesses. And so parents can attempt to, intervene, not be afraid to talk with the health professionals, to tell them what their, children and young persons needs really with respect to the illness. If I could just say something about the future and the future treatments and symptoms and where we are now with long COVID. And I think there's exciting opportunities that, whereas in the past with ME/CFS, because of the small number of people researching, the small amount of money that has been available to do it, and the lack of consistent knowledge and belief from the health professionals, never been taught in our medical schools. Now there's a lot of change. I think with a huge amount of investment going into long COVID, a lot more really important researchers actually joining research, there's going to be much more opportunities for I think alleviating symptoms. So I'm kind of excited about that. When I started working on ME/CFS, I always intended to, maybe at the last stages of my research career, having just won a national science medal, I was told by two senior people, why are you wasting your time working on this? And the good thing now is I just read today an article where a researcher had been told this in the United States, and she said it's so exciting now because people are so interested in what she's doing now, whereas before she was told, she's just wasting her time. And I find that, I've been researching for over 50 years. The international community have been interested in what I've done, and I've discovered a few things, and that's all been good. But generally, hasn't made impact on the public. Now I get invitations to give talks and interviews with the press, the print press, radio and television every week. And they're interested to know about ME/CFS. This has never happened, and its relationship to long COVID. So to me, that's exciting. And in the United States, it's quite clear this is going on. And so there is a lot of optimism that we'll actually make some progress in the future. I mean, I can give you a couple of examples. There have been some drugs that have been promising for ME/CFS, but they never could get approval for proper clinical trials. Things like Ampligen and low-dose naltrexone, which I'm interested in because that's an anti-inflammatory, neuroinflammatory drug, and we think neuroinflammation is a critical feature of the diseases. Now, with long COVID, it's thought that actually they're starting to do sort of preclinical trials, and there's a clear hope that there will be a clinical trial done with that. Similarly, we've done work on oxidative stress in ME/CFS, and we've got evidence that oxidative stress is occurring. And so antioxidants are things which can possibly alleviate oxidative stress, but there are a number of different ones, and they might be helpful in some people individually and not others. And there's no clinical trials been done on these. These are things like coenzyme Q, MitoQ, N-acetylcysteine, for example, the precursor to the main antioxidant in the body, glutathione. And if glutathione levels go down in the brain, it's known this can cause the brain to misfunction. So there's a lot of excitement now that these trials will occur, and we'll have more choices. And the other thing which I'm really excited about is that ME/CFS people, through the history, my 30 years experience of the disease, there's been very poor access to social services and to financial aid, not only in New Zealand, but certainly true in New Zealand, but also internationally. And now governments are taking interest in long COVID, and it's quite clear there will be much more support for certainly people with long COVID and financial aid. The problem is to get the ME/CFS community connected into that. And, at the moment, one of the disappointments for me is that while there's excitement, in the New Zealand Ministry of Health about doing something for long COVID, when you quietly say, but ME CFS patients need to be included in this because the diseases are incredibly similar, there's at most a lukewarm response, and we have to be constantly working on that, I think.